And as it was stated in the announcement, I should maybe have put it bold preliminary in the abstract, because I hope that the goal of the seminar is to help me also to move further with this research, because the main bulk of analysis is yet to be done, because now I'm in the process of finalizing collection of data and organizing it, which was largely happened due to the support of CASI. And what I'm presenting today is some preliminary findings, observations, and maybe some venues where I can move this analysis of data which I'm finished collecting and finalizing collecting with this issue. And as you may see from the title, it's a bit ambitious, which I realized at the beginning. And now I'm trying to put things together which are quite wide, and sometimes I'm squeezing out my fingers, but I hope that something which is emerging is making sense and it's becoming coherent, and the new comments will be quite valuable to how to move further analysis towards a more coherent stage. So, it's localization of norms. It's comparative effects. It's not necessarily a comparative study at the moment. So we focus on 3 countries of Central Asia, which are taken, which is Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, and the 3 issue areas, which is gender, ethnicity and human rights. And for me, generally, the whole point of research started with the question of the presence of inequality and why do we need to study it? Because I was first interested in transition studies and in regime dynamics, and quite often regime was identified from the point of view of spectrum of participation and competition, and from that when we're looking at democracy and autocracy, extreme sides of the spectrum and different hybrid, semi-authoritarian, semi-democratic regimes in between. We're talking about hybrids and different subtypes, etc. So I'm not going on that very much. And what is interesting for me, the regimes which fall on the authoritarian and semi-authoritarian spectrum, and how do they deal with arranging and structuring the public life, which I think is an interesting area to look at, and especially what political leadership of these regimes has main interest, how they manipulate the public life. And from that perspective, there are a lot of literature, some from Andrei Schiller, about the meaning of immigration, and one of the recent ones by Edward Schutz, about the toolkit of soft authoritarianism. And from this kind of study, there are certain aspects emerging in the way of how regimes are trying to structure and define the norms which govern the public life. And for me, it's interesting with this article by Edward Schutz, one of the toolkit, one of the instruments is a toolkit, which he defines, which is interesting, is this discursive preemption, in the way how the regimes are trying to engage in more persuasive way, rather than coercive way, of defining what is normal and what is not normal. And of course, from that perspective, you can look how regimes may have more dominant approach towards coercive versus persuasive mechanisms. For me, maybe it's not a matter of importance at the moment, but I'm trying to look from that perspective at the norms as such, how they work. And I'm trying to look at the 3 quite broad issue areas, human rights, gender, ethnicity, which are by themselves quite broad, from a one, I hope, narrowing perspective, which is the participation in public life, and which hopefully will put all the 3 issue areas together. And norms in political science literature is defined in various ways, but there is a certain consensus that they're considered to be the sort of standards of appropriate behavior within a given identity. And institutionally, sometimes they define as a stable collection of practices and rules. And there are certain aspects of norms which are important, whether they are prescriptive or evaluative. And these aspects of norms make them distinct from other rules. And norms, well, norm making or norm diffusion of norms is quite wide literature, and they're looking at the diffusion from different perspectives. It could be like learning from early adopters, when we take norm from someone who already adopted it. And because of the competition, because we need to adopt it, because we want to be on the curve ahead of our competitors. And sometimes we adopt because we imitate or and try to enforce. And there are some other variations of the same kind of instruments of diffusion. It's norms because they course from outside, the competition come there, and learning as well. And as well as annulation, because the norm becomes a norm because no one already disputes that. And some late other T's they already adopted it because, well, no one disputes it anymore. Let's say slavery at some point became a norm. It's not normal anymore to have slavery in our societies. So that's certain aspect which, for me, it's important because I'm trying to look at the localization in regard to what is coming from outside. Because if you would imagine that these three issues areas apply to post-Soviet countries like Central Asian countries, quite often mean that many of the norms regulating public life perceive to be coming from outside. Either from the West, so-called, from international institutions, and maybe more recently coming from our neighbors like Russia, or maybe from some eastern directions with increased sense of religiosity, maybe, and more presence of certain religious trends in the politics. And when we look from the perspective of norms which are coming from outside, you can also try to look at certain issues of leveraging. And here's a more sort of Medet Tiulegenov and others in terms of how someone can try to persuade to have a leverage on different countries. And then finally, in terms of this conceptualization, I was trying to look, especially if we look at the norm making as a part of the aspects of the tools of the soft authoritarians as persuasive instrument. Then I think the framing also comes into issue. The framing literature in political science quite often is associated with the social movement cases, but I think it's quite wider than that. In that sense, we can look at the frames of the struggle and production, mobilizing or counter-mobilizing ideas and meanings, and amplification, extension, inmate amplification, extensions to existing ideologies or their components. So in that sense, I think when we look at this transformation of post-Soviet countries for the quarter century of transition, I think that's something we should also keep in mind. So, and then here's a brief illustration, which I found some time ago. For me, was interesting. And maybe it's not a very illustration. It was a speech which was made by Kiev in March of 2009. It was a State of the Union address to the nation, and he referred quite heavily to human rights. And the way he talked about the human rights is interesting because he was talking about the need to have a sound balance between the major forms of right. And also he referred to the need to adhere to human rights, but in such ways, to quote him, to infringe and not to infringe on the rights of other people, of society, and of nature. And so then he elaborates on trying to distinguish different forms of rights. So it's rights of society, defended from destruction of its basis and values, environmental rights, rights of ancestors for protection against destruction of national memory, and rights of descendants for dignified future. So that's partially something which is in local Kyrgyz context when we see a certain explicit so-called cultural politics which is coming into the place. And partially it was driven by certain advisors who are coming in and helping the Kiev to form this last year, it was April 2010, the aspects and maybe the features of regime which need some legitimate basis. And in that sense, the discourse in regard to the rights, which is coming out with that speech, was for me an illustration of how the norm-making becomes contentious. First, in terms of trying to elaborate the different norms and trying to find a specific focus which is important for the regime and different specific forms of rights. And then if you notice the last sentence, a reference that we are not following after the foreign bias, which is we may quite often find in the record of presidents in the post-Soviet region, especially in this region, in terms of are we making norms ourselves or we're trying to resist something which is coming from outside. So for me it was also an interesting illustration, a way to look at localization of norms as opposed to something which comes from outside. So that's an illustration. And then what generally I was trying to have a bit more of an inductive approach in terms of understanding the norm making and localization of norms, and looking how the norms, why and how norms relate to participation in public life in these three issue areas are localized. And the process I was going through, and still I'm going through, is trying to create a database of presidential speeches of all the countries for the 25 years, and then to do analysis of those speeches. Then to see what has been happening with the normative changes, legal normative changes, what laws in regard to the three issue areas which regulate the participation in public life, how they changed, and then to create some database of international mechanisms related to universal periodic review of UN, reports of Human Rights Watch, Department of State, and etc., in terms of understanding what was the reaction to these issue areas from outside. And of course, in that sense, the database may be not very much wide, because I should limit to a few examples. And then I was doing some stochastic, first of all, this just last week finalized interviewing in different locations in these three countries, in Bishkek, Tashkent, Astana, and Almaty. And in some areas, of course, you can imagine that there were some limitations. In Tashkent, I was able to speak, even limited with only gender issues. I didn't dare to talk about two other issue areas. So, why to look at these three countries? Because I thought this, initially you can look at the three countries from a spectrum of level of acceptance of anything which comes from outside in terms of reforming the public life in these countries. Uzbekistan being on the most denied side of the spectrum, and Kyrgyzstan being on the most accepting relative side, whereas Kazakhstan falls in between these two countries. And these issue areas for me were interesting that in terms of the political sensitivity, how these issue areas in terms of regulating participation in public life are sensitive for the regime itself. So in that sense, I thought that human rights are quite high in terms of sensitivity, whereas gender, well, considerably low, and ethnicity, it's medium, sometimes very high depending on the context. And there's certain historical embeddedness, meaning that the norms are not necessarily coming from outside at the onset of the transition. Let's say the breakup of the Soviet Union, some also considered to be the legacy of the Soviet Union. Or sometimes the source of the norms are related to not necessarily something coming from the West. Maybe it's related to the traditions, to religion, to many frameworks, wider frameworks, within which certain norm presented, within which the norm is presented. And then maybe some external sensitivity in the ways that how, in relation to some active, tautology active actors, those who are active from outside on these issue areas of these given countries, to what extent these issues are sensitive. And these human rights seems to be quite high, gender high, and ethnicity, I was thinking in regard to this specific countries for medium to high. And again, it depends on the context, because sometimes it can be high regarding the post-George-2010 events in Kyrgyzstan. They became high, but in other situations maybe the medium level importance. And then these three country cases, they're also interesting to look from specific maybe administrative perspectives. So I just look at the universal periodic review and the recommendations they received, and then what's happened with the reaction of these countries towards the recommendations coming from outside. And as you see, three countries say undergone, it's just the first cycle. I haven't included the second cycle. For some of these countries have already undergone the second cycle of review. And the second column indicates the level of rejection. How many recommendations coming from outside countries tend to reject? It's in database of UPR put as noted, but in fact it means rejected. So as you see, Kazakhstan is the most accepted. So the level of rejection is just a bit over 5%. Kyrgyzstan is a bit higher, 12%, and almost half of all recommendations coming to Uzbekistan is rejected. And it's interestingly that Uzbekistan was pointed as a country, I think the only country within only three countries, including also Egypt and Singapore, which rejecting with the argumentation of factual wrongs, meaning that the things that, as I state, the recommendations are based on wrong facts. So that's also an indication of certain discursive mechanisms how participation is there, because all countries in the world virtually, including such countries as Uzbekistan, participated in the mechanism. But the way of participation is also peculiar, especially this type of argumentation, which is I mentioned. And then it's also interesting in terms of course, level of economic development, with GDP per capita. Kazakhstan was being the richest, Uzbekistan is high, Kyrgyzstan is the previous number 3, and then a certain level of dependence on external actors, which is, we can look at as overseas development assistance as a percentage of gross national income. And you can see that Kyrgyzstan, of course, the most dependent, and two other countries are less dependent. And then the level of democracy, we can say so, based on the Freedom House scores. Kyrgyzstan is the most democratic, Kazakhstan more autocratic, and Uzbekistan is the almost highest on that, on the score, highest on that also. So, what this tells us, it's partially the picture of this engagement in different discursive mechanisms with external institutions, but also maybe whether the country can be prone to coercion. If you remember when we discussed the diffusion of norms, coercion was one of the mechanisms. And for the dependency on foreign aid, sometimes can be viewed as a certain proxy measure of, like if you're dependent, you tend to be maybe more prone to be coerced. Because as we know that many of the foreign aid that often comes with strings attached, with conditionalities of course, and many of them will touch upon the issues which I'm dealing with in this research. And here's a, sorry maybe it's not very much visible, I try to squeeze a table of ratification of human rights conventions of these 3 countries. I will just go through several important aspects, because we don't need to go through all of them, because I think there are around 20 major human rights treaties. But what's interesting that when we look at the norms as an appropriate standard of behavior, and if these 3 issue areas, they looked at through the right perspective, rights perspective. So that the rights perspective quite often may say, as literature suggests, that you realize rights in steps. First we recognize, then we realize, and then we protect. So it's like a Gapman scale, that if you do the next step, it means that you already included the previous step. So in that sense, this table suggests that it's a level of recognition that happens. And then it's not very much a bizarre picture, but it's something which we don't in many other regions and in many other cases as well. That some countries like it's Uzbekistan, if you don't see the upper row, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, the first row. But Uzbekistan adopted many important treaties, one of the first one. It's ICCPR, it's about political rights, it's about eliminating racial discrimination, it's about the CEDAW, it's about the Convention Against Torture, and etc. etc. Whereas other countries are a bit later. And then you can see also the pattern with the optional protocols related to these treaties. So sometimes in the literature, scholars ask why dictatorships sign up on the conventions that they can torture. And here's a pure illustration you can place that sometimes it makes sense because you don't need to report because there is nothing much comes out in terms of facts on which you can then maybe criticize in different international mechanisms. And then maybe the issue is that UPR and then many of the recommendations were rejected on the basis that they are factually wrong. They are maybe partially related to this as well. So you can sign a treaty and then you can live through different interactions with the international community without any new consequences. So in that sense, Uzbekistan developed the early stages of the transition, and then some of the other rights, so some of the conventions that were signed almost dozen years after, whereas two other countries were progressing a bit in a different pace. So, in terms of coercion as a diffusion mechanism, does it work or not? When you look at the 3 cases, maybe just now I'm relying on the observations and partially introducing to them. That of course depends on foreign aid, is one of the factors may probably suggest that it plays a role, and it played a role in the case of Kyrgyzstan, and of course it less so, and it maybe doesn't play a role in two other countries. And when you think about other mechanisms of coercion besides dependence on foreign aid, in terms of other mechanisms, maybe there's not so much. And the only thing which comes, well, Uzbekistan since the beginning have taken peculiar observation is politics in the way of not interacting very much and not being dependent on different international mechanisms, whereas for Kazakhstan, it is becoming the chair, or assuming the real chairmanship of the AUCA in 2010, and therefore also there is a way how to prompt the country to improve on certain human rights standards. But of course, whether or not to consider the closed mechanism is a question, but still, as we know, it hasn't worked very much in that sense. And socialization, again, as we see in the case of Uzbekistan, it's a bit difficult because the country is isolated in terms of its interactions. Meaning interaction, not social generally, but meaning interaction of political elite with different international organizations and regional organizations, whereas for two other countries maybe it's more official being in embedded membership in different international organizations. And then the issue in question is that you're taking certain norms and whether participation in different mechanisms of regional organizations is having an effect. Of course, it's quite difficult to trace, but you can hypothesize that there's certain laws which are adopted in the parliaments of these countries may hypothetically be driven by, let's say, participating A in the Parliamentary Assembly of OSCE, or B participating in Parliamentary Assembly of CIS, and then which may have more effect. It's quite difficult to say precisely, but there was interesting work done by Asya. She wrote about the Parliamentary Assembly of CIS, and then she was quite persuasive. It was arguing that the creation of so-called model laws within this mechanism somehow affected the legislation in many participating countries. And in that sense, we can see that socialization somehow through that mechanism may have a sort of normative impact. And then emulation is a bit difficult to see how it works as a mechanism in this case, as norms coming from outside. And maybe we're better to talk about emulation from perspective not with external but internal factors. For the Soviet legacy, to what extent certain norms which were developed already within gender especially, and ethnicity to some extent, they played a role. And maybe less was so with human rights, because human rights, unlike two other issue areas, were considered to be a bit of a novel, normative area, whereas the gender and ethnicity was considered to be to some extent a continuation of this. Plus, of course, a certain transformation, which I will illustrate with some examples later. And then I'll proceed to a few more slides, with which I'll finish with some what I think could be viewed as a preliminary findings. And then one of them is variations of institutionalization of norms. To some extent, norms, if you take an institutional perspective, is a collection of rules and practices. And here, just as an illustration, on the upper side of the slide, broadly, one of the issue areas is gender. And to what extent women participate in some part in public life. And then how this as a norm is regulated in these three countries. And then, of course, the percentage of women in the parliament, actually it's in the parliament meant to be in its lower house or in single houses, it's single house parliament. And then picture it's similar in the countries, but lower in Uzbekistan. But what is important is that does it bring a certain meaning, and then how institutionally, looking across different institutions, and in different regimes, of course, different institutions matter more or less, and parliament is sometimes the rubber-stamping institutions in two of our case countries. And in that sense, the issue of mobilization of strategies, which regimes employ in terms of engaging in public life, because engagement sometimes considered to be important, but for various purposes and with different mechanisms. And in that sense, the corporatist versus pluralist perspective is, I think, an aspect through which we can look at this socialization. As a pluralistic is looked to be viewed more in case of Kyrgyzstan and to quite an extent in Kazakhstan, whereas in Uzbekistan it's more like incorporation of women's engagement in the public life. And that specifically can be illustrated in the issue of the Soviet legacy, so-called women's committees, because we know that the Soviet time is a participation of women in politics or in public life. It was organized with that system of women's committees, and the legacy of that system has been different in different countries. Yes, even in Kyrgyzstan it still remains. We have a lot of women's committees at the lower municipal levels, but then the issue, especially it was interesting to talk to introduce about what happens with them, is not finding the place for themselves, because they are a legacy of another system, and now they're trying to be embedded in a certain new pluralistic civil society type of system. And they cannot find themselves, because they don't consider themselves as pure civil society, and there's a certain drive to be attached to a certain corporate system which used to be in the Soviet times. Whereas as the other extreme, in Uzbekistan it was developed in the utmost level, almost repeating the same way it was done in the Soviet times, but of course with a certain dent of post-Soviet ethnic sort of normative outlook. Because when you talk in Uzbekistan, and I was lucky was happy to talk to representative of the leadership of this community, that they view themselves as a civil society. But at the same time they incorporated into the government, because the chairman of the Women's Committee is the highest level, because it's quite a vertical system. It goes up through the local levels and up to Mahalas. Once elected, of course, a state election, but even formally elected, then she becomes the vice prime minister. So it's a vice prime ministerial position. So in this sense, this is discursively locally viewed as civil society, which is embedded in the governmental structure. So in that sense, quite often when you talk about participation of women in public life, women's committees heavily come into picture in the case of Uzbekistan. So in that sense, that's a bit of a peculiar system, and it's quite far from the pluralistic system which you can see in Kyrgyzstan. And in Kazakhstan, it's partially in between. And let's say, if we are talking about the bit more formal engagement of women and the socialization of the engagement in politics, and let's say the issues of regulating and making it more legal normative basis, creating legal normative basis for their participation through laws and particularly through quotas. And then in Kyrgyzstan, there are certain formal quotas which are also based on the bit more pluralistic understanding of the political system. Although, of course, we should take into account that they were created at the time of Bakiyev trying to create a dominant party system, but eventually they are functioning nowadays in a more pluralistic system. Whereas in Kazakhstan, they are functioning as a part of the dominant party system and not having the formal quotas. There is a certain informal obligation of parties to have quotas, and they are regulated through different mechanisms and quite often informally. And then the comparative organization I mentioned already about in reference to the women's committees in Uzbekistan. So, institutionalization flows theorized, but also I talked very much about the gender issue. But then there is certain aspect related to the other two issue areas, which maybe I will just slightly touch upon because I'm still analyzing the data which I collected. But seemingly that formality, the democratic facade happened in all of the three countries, in a way of creating the councils on human rights, the committees on human rights, and then at some point creating the institutions of ombudsman, and etc. But of course, underneath the surface, there are different varieties of the way how this, in fact, functioning. And what is interesting in case of the ethnicity and participation in public life, and you can look, maybe I'll more talk about this case which I'm more familiar with the moment with Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, shows the assembly of peoples as a way how to work and engage with ethnicity as a certain marker or certain aspect of and in Kyrgyzstan and in Kazakhstan it happened more or less at the same time in the 90s, and to some extent that was also a part of this corporate system, but also in case of Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan it was semi-public, and semi-state. This distinction in Russian and English language, state meaning different than public in English. It's partially civil society or national cultural centers which organize themselves in different ways, and then they come together to be part of this assembly of peoples of Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, and that in certain ways they are connected to the state apparatus as well. And that the mechanism which was created in early transition still remains. And from that perspective, the institutionalization has happened and then doesn't have very much of a dynamic and then normative pressure. The normative pressure on possible change was diffused in both countries, but in Kyrgyzstan maybe unsuccessfully after these events of June 2010. But the pressure was quite often coming, and maybe this discursive preemption of Edward Schatz is quite interesting in a way how the norm making through the public or rhetorical statement was coming from presidential speeches, and if you look through the speeches of presidents of both countries, quite often ethnicity and security, stability, peace was related. So securitization of the talk about the ethnicity quite often was a certain general master frame through which the norm of ethnicity in terms of whether or not to participate and how to participate in public life was shaped. And to some extent it led first to the vagueness of certain mechanisms how to participate, because quite often it just was ending with a need to work all together for the common future of the country, and especially for the sake of stability, because stability was an overriding argumentation why we need to pay attention to this area. Whereas, of course, after June 2010, there were new elements and contextual aspects which come into this issue, and therefore it became a bit more complicated in terms of participation of ethnic minorities in public life. And here we're coming back to the high prominence of external sensitivity. Because now many officials who supposedly formally or informally, by the way, 2010 was a quite important period when government has already a bit more formal approach to issues of ethnicity, because we have two governmental structures, one within the President administration and another is relayed agency for local government and interest relations, plus we have a conception and strategy on unity of nation and interested relations. So formally and informally, the government started to work on this issue, and quite often started to work on this issue with external actors. So therefore, this prominence of external norm-making after June 2010 was much, much higher than it was before that. And it's just a raw graph made in relation to how we can see human rights in the presidential rhetoric. So I will still continue working at that, maybe in different format, but it's just a certain counts of how many times human rights in different ways, in different adjectives and etc. was coming in two countries for the period in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. So the red bars are Kyrgyzstan and the blue bars are Kazakhstan. So as you see, there is certain silence. In Kazakhstan, we see the rhetoric of presidents, or one president is called, about the human rights. And even if it comes, as you see, it just comes once in the late 90s, and then it comes in the mid-2000s, and then in the early 2011s. In part of it, it's a bit more negative, trying to say that we are trying to respond to something which is coming from outside, or maybe something that's neutral, because it's a reference to some documents, not necessarily talking substantively about human rights. So that already maybe says something to us in terms of the certain discourse in the way how it's framed. Especially if we will do probably about this in terms of other associated with rights. Words like freedom, etc., maybe there could be another variation. But of course you see some striking difference between two countries, whereas Kyrgyzstan has quite high, especially the peak comes in 2003 when a guy was talking about the constitution. That's many of these counts of the human rights come in this speech about the change of the constitution of the time. And then it's coming in 2005, and by the way, most of it comes in the archive, whereas the key speeches of the year were mostly in one text, in his speech at the UN General Assembly, where he should have talked, of course, about human rights, but domestically, when he rarely talked about human rights, and only maybe comes in 2009 and then 2011. 10. And then Otumbayev is like Akayev, one of the most frequent speaking about human rights. Whereas Otumbayev still continues to talk, but that database should be corrected if we try to put different types of speeches. Because addresses to the nation is one type, talking to the parliament generally is another type. If you exclude, because there's certain variation of this collected documents, it's around 150 documents, which is still being collected. And here, if you'll exclude, let's say, congratulations kind of speeches, then Atambayev will be silent this. Nazarbayev. Because all of the speeches, it's congratulations on the Day of Human Rights. If you take away all congratulations, then the current presidency is silent about human rights. It is rhetorical. So, that's part of the picture, and that's the issue of the timing. And it's the issue also with certain maybe past dependence. I hope that we'll be able to collect further the documents related to the 90s, which will help us to understand what's happening in terms of this early onset. But seemingly, the early organization of Pakistan has been there. And then once you start to talk and set a certain tone on what we're talking about, may matter. But also, this, of course, past dependence should be viewed with some caution because, let's say, the regime type generally after 2010 is more similar to presidents. Also, Otumbayev presidency is quite short, but still, the quite stark difference between two presidents with the same more or less political situation, talking one prominently, one silently, being silent on the human rights. It also puts a question when past dependence plays a role, and in which way. Maybe the rhetorical aspect is not as important as the institutional, which will be analyzed based on the legal documents. Then there is a need to take into account the reforms adjacency, and that's why I mentioned that the need to change the constitution prompted, of course, Akayev to talk a lot about human rights. And when you engage in different reforms, you need to talk about rights as well. And I think here's one of the speeches, I don't remember which one, from Nazarbayev as well, as it was about the need to get into these 50 top countries or something like that, and then the reference to human rights was put in a context of wider reforms. We need to move to become one of the modern nations, and therefore this modernization framework somehow is inevitably, to some extent, pulls in the human rights as well. And then transitions, what happens before expected transitions, what happens after already happened transitions. I think that also matters because 2004 and 5 speeches of Akayev to some extent were made in view, similarly, of this upcoming succession. Of course, no one knew exactly that the Tulip revolution would happen, but the expectations of change were there anyway. And to some extent, no one could talk about the human rights to some extent were happening in light of the expected transition. And of course, that happened after transition, and that had an effect. And of course, personalities also matter. And maybe that explains the difference. Two presidents under the same, more or less political, in the same political situation, they have different approach. And maybe it's due to personality of these presidents. And then the issues matter, especially when you consider human rights. Here I just brought some examples from the UPR, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan, the most prominent issues which were raised in recommendations. And then, you know, see maybe from outside, but there are, of course, different spectrum and composition of issues. This is not the only issue, but the top issues which are brought with recommendations in UPR. And let's say, of course, in Uzbekistan, the issue of detention is broad, but in Kyrgyzstan it's not important. Elections is an issue brought in Kyrgyzstan, but in two other countries you don't see elections as an issue. Let's say, yes, and that also brings an issue of structures of opportunities as well. Here we're talking about the interaction between local and external. And then how localization may not happen due to a certain prominence of certain issues which are brought from outside. Let's say if some people wonder why elections are not brought, is everything okay with elections? Possibly, of course, not in these two countries, but the issue is that it doesn't make sense to bring elections. And of course, when it was a separate another study, when you look at the recommendations in UPR, there are a lot of studies, and one of them, they call it the mutual praise society. How states make recommendation to other states. And that maybe partially reflects this picture as well, that states, generally what I found out in the study, tends to make recommendation to more democratic countries. So the more democratic you are, the more recommendations you receive. The more autocratic you are, the less recommendations you receive. And NGOs, international NGOs who participate in UPR, they can also make recommendations. It's a reverse curve. The more autocratic the state, the more recommendations they receive from international organizations. And the difference may be explained partially because the states engage in specific relations with each other. They use UPR as a foreign policy tool for pragmatic reasons. And sometimes maybe and partially maybe one of the explanation is that if they don't see the opportunity to engage, they try not to win. Let's say it does make sense to talk about elections if there is no even preconditions for having elections or decent elections. Whereas in the case of Kyrgyzstan, it does make any sense. So that maybe explains this variation. And here's the lower graph. It's still the data being collected, but for the 90s, it's engagement from Human Rights Watch reports. I was trying to make database based on the reports where they cover Central Asia and let's say Uzbekistan. And here you can see how different issues are coming out with each year in the report. And first, of course, what you notice is the spectrum of issues is increasing. And of course, you can understand that, well, first of all, it's the first engagement. It does mean that in 1997 there were fewer issues than in 2000. But maybe it's just a certain process of engagement. You start with something, and then you learn more, and then you engage in different other issues. And I hope that maybe we'll have a bit fuller in terms of time data, and then maybe compare between countries and compare with other reports from the Department of State, from other entities. It will help us to understand also the variability of issues. And then I was planning to some extent to see the co-occurrence of different issues brought from outside with certain normative changes which are happening in the country. So, issues matter. And then, I think it's the last slide, and with that I will finish. The public engagement to some extent means a certain presence of autonomous opinions and engagement from society in the public affairs or government affairs, which is kind of it's a civil society to some extent. And the pace of autonomy, or whether you're autonomous or co-opted, vary in the three countries. And in that sense, you may have a certain variability of pluralism and co-optation. Because when you talk with Uzbekistan about the women's engagement in politics, we refer to women's committee. And that's presented as a certain way how you see public engagement from the perspective of gender. Mobilization of civil society, here we're coming to the issue of nature of the regime. From many scholarly perspectives, mobilization viewed to be quite important for generating loyalty. Well, I'm talking about authoritarian and semi-authoritarian regimes as well. Mostly generating loyalty, and from that perspective, how engagement in public affairs is organized from the point of view of mobilizing to generate loyalty, I think that's something which is interesting to see for these three countries. And of course, pluralistic view of civil society is somehow in Kyrgyzstan, and perspective from the political leadership, is not about mobilization of civil society, but let's say in the post-Soviet period there were some moments and there were different ways how civil society was being mobilized and engaged. Especially these different years, which I think this year in the Kazakhstan, the year of social mobilization. It was one of the examples how mobilization is viewed as a mechanism to engage in what was perceived as a engagement in public life. Whereas in other countries it's a bit more of a different way, and mobilizing people in general, not necessarily civil society, is one of the ways how you connect government and society at large. Let's say the work in cotton fields is one of the ways. But when we talk about the civil society, I think the discourse on civil society and then the discourse, especially in Uzbekistan, from perspective of civil society, is something which is connected to the government, is already framing and maybe make a certain normative outlook of what can be perceived as civil society. And the same, well, it's probably an ongoing issue, and the story is not finished yet, happening in Kazakhstan, especially in terms of this law which is being adopted in Kazakhstan, because now we have this trend in the whole wide region in terms of this foreign agents law and different other laws which regulate somehow the engagement of the functioning of civil society, and then the engagement with public life and with the government. And then I already talked about civil society as institutionally embedded. Again, the extreme illustration is Women's Committee in Uzbekistan, when the, let's say, conceptually, the person can be viewed as a chairman of the big association, but then the person becomes a vice prime minister, functional. So there's a functional side of the work of the government. And then this discourse on civil society as a way of making certain normative framework for public engagement. Do they have a silence or do they have a certain prominence? And if there is certain prominence, in which ways discourse is happening and who and how shaped? Let's say the Kyrgyzstan as a case country is interesting because it has a certain variability under different presidents. And like with human rights rhetoric, if you analyze the content of the speech of Localizing and his and other presidents, the rhetoric on civil society was quite prominent in Localizing's case, and quite low in Localizing's case. So somehow rhetoric on human rights and civil societies are associated with each other. And sometimes if it's talked about, then it's hijacked for different purposes, of course. I would say that speech of 2013, sorry, of 2003, but it was, no, 2004, when Akayev was talking about the civil society, and then there was a certain institution which was created, but I think it was not abolished yet. He created a Council on Democratic Security. And that for him was one of the ways somehow to institutionalize his notion, first of civil society and second of human rights. And again, to some extent maybe it was an early approach trying to securitize the perspective on rights. So the need to secure some democratic values, including human rights, but it wasn't clear at the time from whom, and then due to Turing revolution, the whole thing didn't develop further. And then the hijacking, of course, happens in the extreme case in Uzbekistan and Uzbekistan. If you look at the kind of speeches, civil society as a term emerges quite a lot since early 1993. Several speeches which we're having, and then civil society is viewed, of course, from a different perspective than what we usually imply. Say about the civil society as autonomous institutions working for the public good outside of the state. And maybe the final point in terms of recognizing or denying the agency. And maybe that's one of the important points for me, which I'm still trying to develop, in ways that participation in public life quite often means that there is someone who is participating. And then how the law making implies who is that someone. Because when we talk about the human rights, of course we're talking about an individual generally. Because we're applying universal perspective. And mostly it's reflected in the civil and political, civil rights and political liberties. As what conventions say, that the national laws further translated. And when it comes to the gender, it also, agency somehow is a bit shifty. To some extent, depending on the country context, is it woman in a gender aggregated way? And then in that sense, if you look at the Karima speeches, usually quite often it comes like what you may see in speeches on March 8th. That women's a precious part of society, etc., etc., etc. So the specific role which is being normatively framed around who is an agent and whether or not she may participate in the political life is not present in the political rhetoric of president of that country. So less so in Kazakhstan and in Kyrgyzstan as well. But in Kyrgyzstan maybe there are And when it comes to the civil society part of it, that's, I think, also another story related to the way how civil society is organized and connected. Again, we're coming back to an example of Women's Committee. That's an agent or agency of participating from gender perspective through that kind of institutions. If you look at the ethnicity as an area where the agency can be viewed, that's also, I think, like with gender issues, either it's members of individual members of different ethnic groups, or viewed as, from rights perspective, as autonomous individuals having the same possibilities and opportunities to participate in public life, or as sort of organized groups. And mostly, I know more at this moment about the Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan when it comes to the so-called national cultural centers. How and in which ways they participate in public life. And here we coming back to the Assembly of Peoples, which is viewed as the utmost way in which they participate. And in that sense, I think in the area of ethnicity, the governments of these two countries are really stretched between these two perspectives. Individual, autonomous individuals who are members of different ethnic groups participating in public life, whether this approach is viewed in terms of the norm-making or through the national cultural centers who are members of these assemblies of peoples. And in Kazakhstan, the second version is dominating, whereas in Kyrgyzstan, especially it's an effect of June 2010. There is divergence in terms of norm-making between these two institutional approaches. So with that, I'm finishing. I thank you that you were with me till the end.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm not just sure I understand fully what is meant by localization of norms. So is it about having kind of domestic institutions that are tasked with implementation of these international norms? Or is it about kind of translating what these norms mean? So like the example from Bakiyev's speech of how it's really kind of like in the tradition, and it's common sense, and it's not kind of being imposed from outside. And yeah, so because I see the examples you give of institutions, they really go back to the Soviet time, right? This women's committees and assemblies of the people, and yeah, this kind of common sense understanding of what like women's involvement in politics would mean, etc., or ethnic groups' involvement in politics. So I'm just curious whether more localization is seen as something positive in this kind of paradigm of yeah, kind of norms diffusion or norms cascade or whatever it's called. In our region, more localization would probably mean not such a good thing, because like we have laws that are much more liberal than beliefs that are held by a majority of the people, right? So, and then it's also visible in how some laws are interpreted and then implemented or practiced. So like, for example, bride kidnapping law is there, but it's not applied in practice, and things like that. So yeah, if you could explain more what localization means.
Yes, thank you. In the beginning I had the adjective external, localizing external norms. But then throughout my interviews, quite often I found out it's quite difficult to talk to people in terms of what they think is external. And then I thought maybe I'll try to look from a equally different perspectives, not only about the external, but maybe other perspectives through which norms are emerging. Generally, norm is a novelty. Something which wasn't present, and all of a sudden we have to somehow deal with it and then try to adapt. Because adaptation could be viewed as another substitute for the localization. So that was my general premise. And then in terms of localization, I was mostly dealing with these novel ideas and norms which need to be embedded in the country context, and looking mostly through three things: how they talked about in the political rhetoric. That's why I look at the presidential speeches. How they regulated the norms acceptance. And here I'm looking from this three-level approach, maybe two-level, let's say. Either recognized, generally, conventions, and etc. Big issues, but then whether they transfer to the national legislation. And even maybe further, if I'm able to look not only at the general laws, but also different ministerial acts and whether they are translated in the regulation of different lower levels. And then the third aspect is institutional, which is coming maybe through my talk in the presentation, where I'm trying to see whether it indeed, in fact, is working, let's say. And that's, altogether, I hope will probably bring some general comprehensive picture of the localization. And I would maybe be able to trace that something emerges an idea, and then what it looked like when it emerges an idea, and then how it was then embedded, both in practice, institutionally, well, if we can say so, and then how it was transforming itself, was transformed rhetorically as well. Let's say how the talk about the ethnicity was going through, let's say, presidential speeches that I was hoping to find, and the transformation of through the discourse, to some extent, for me, is also localization. But maybe to make it a bit more coherent, I was trying to look at the emergence and then how it was taking a certain final shape, which may be not necessarily true because there was no final shape, maybe there were some different transformations. And then I was maybe trying to look at certain maybe hubs of this transformation. When there was a more or less coherent set of meanings around the same norm, which I can trace throughout this post-Soviet period. And that for me would be also maybe localization. But to say shortly, maybe from novelty to something which is considered to be part, disputable, but still part of our society, so-called, within all three countries. That for me will be the process of localization.
What I'm interested in, you mentioned that, okay, analyzing these presidential speeches is an important part of the research you're doing. And then you said how some of these, I don't know, human rights, gender, ethnicity issues are translated into laws by these Central Asian countries. And of course, if some of these laws are new, we can sort of suspect that have been inspired by the existing international laws. For me, what is interesting, I mean, when, well, the laws use words, they are formulated in a particular way, that is the language of laws. Presidential speeches are also quite a lot, you know, a sort of a verbal, discursive performance. And in your research, do you try a little bit also to sort of see whether there are, I mean, borrowings? I mean, when, I don't know, a new law on also, I don't know on which aspect on human rights is sort of introduced or recommended by Kyrgyzstan, is the wording this law, does the wording of the law completely imitate, I don't know, a law that already exists? Is it changed, and how? And then to what an extent in their speeches these presidents sort of use a kind of common vocabulary? You see a little bit what I mean? Or to what an extent they develop their own way to discuss these issues?
Yes, I think it's important, especially when talking about the agency, and let's say as an illustration of the issue of ethnicity. I'm hoping to find, let's say, the wording of ethnic minorities, the term. Because it's important to look for it in the speeches, in the laws, because quite often it implies, if you name it that way, it brings a certain agency and a certain perspective of participation. And let's say, so far what I noticed, there is a certain deliberate way to avoid bringing both in speeches as well as in laws as well. Because if you all of a sudden bring ethnic minorities as a term into the law, it brings a lot of consequences. And in that sense, I think maybe, I don't know, is this proper example of what you're asking. I'm looking for that instances. And I have not maybe finished analyzing all the speeches, but the term ethnic minority is interesting. Is it mentioned or not? Because let's say in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, I know that the official rhetoric is referred to ethnic group. All the ethnic groups. But one ethnic group is more important than others. And then how is that imagine structure of hierarchical structure of ethnic groups is reflected in language, both language of political rhetoric and language of laws. That's what I try to look as well. And maybe even if I wouldn't find a specific term, referred to term, I'm looking maybe for some maybe proxy textual explanations how this structure, egalitarian or hierarchical, is reflected, let's say, in the case of ethnic groups. Because I think there are certain tensions. Imagining the public life of ethnic groups hierarchically, because there is one ethnic group there, and still trying to push for equality, and then how, in terms of political rhetoric and discourse, it happens. And in that sense, yes, that's one of the examples, and I try to look at specific wording, how texts somehow reflect a certain meaning, which then reflected in the public life.
But my question is, on this whole process of norm diffusion, adaptation, and hopefully implementation, to what extent do you think it's real? That is that I think overall, you know, just observing the region and so forth, that this whole process of, let's say, the international bodies proposing a certain convention, and then normally, as you said, it comes with an optional protocol later on, let's say with torture, it's optional protocol on torture and so forth, that there is this detachment from the population. There are all these fancy, even like this report UPR that you mentioned is Universal Periodic Review, which are really good reports. But even I think for specialists, it's difficult to actually find these documents. They're worded very strangely and so forth. I guess what I'm trying to say is that to what extent do these norms resonate in the populations? And maybe that's one component that you may want to investigate. Do the populations know, the people, ordinary people know about these norms, and what do they think? And when we talk about localization, maybe another term on top of that or below that would be ownership. Do the population and the government and civil society really own these? Do they really believe in it? Or is it virtual? For example, civil societies may do anything as long as the donors pay. You know, and they're not going to rock the boat simply because if there's a specific violation, if the civil society becomes too active, well, the Ministry of Justice will shut them down. So then after a few years, we deal with very docile civil society that really don't do anything besides getting the money, going to international meetings and writing some reports here and there and sponsoring some seminars. So again, my question is, how real is this, or is this whole process virtual really from start to bottom?
Yeah, I think that Wilson's virtual politics was one of my misconceptions of how to place it, or performative politics, in this historic literature, which somehow describes it as, maybe presented in that way as well, that normative production of norms is a certain performance. That what is a performative acts and what is a more real substantive, you can see maybe a certain divide. And in that sense, maybe civil society is also engaged in this performance part of it, in terms of trying to work out in terms of production of meanings, what norms are important, but then the translation and communication maybe happens in a more narrow circle. And I noticed in my interviews in Roche, and my specific purpose was to see whether things are translated in terms of norm making beyond the capital. And my general sense that somehow, of course, beyond capital it's much, much more. And I was not looking at the societies or populations perspective, but rather about the different layers or levels of government, how they act in terms of norm. Because it's interesting to see conventions signed, laws transformed, ministries trying to adapt, but then local administrations, local governments, how they relate. And if not even taking aside the population generally, looking at this whole vertical of the government, how we see that the lower you go from the central area, further from the center, the less of a normative impact you see, especially when it comes to the government side. And quite often I would suspect that it's related to the framing as well. First, because I don't understand. And second, maybe because what happens within the government somehow is a parallel and detached to what happens generally in society. Here society comes in the picture because quite often those who are supposed to implement protect rights, they are quite often part of the society. And let's say the law may say that the militia or police officer should deal in terms of the domestic violence a certain way, but he acts in a way how he thinks in his social environment he should act. And therefore there is a certain tension between norms coming formally and norms which are coming from the social surrounding, the social pressure. Well, let's say, should I do something according to the law with a woman who suffers from domestic violence, or I just should do as quite often police officers do, let's deal it silently within your own family, and etc. So there is certain issues like that. I don't know whether it's coming very much prominently in that specific area of interest, participation in public life. But in case of Kyrgyzstan, I would imagine that the general norm of citizens engaged in public life is there. But the intricacies, how, and much more specific norms in terms of engagement, they are not maybe very much communicated and prescribed. Because I think the issue is norm making a bit problematic, not when it comes to the human rights, because let's say, in the case of Kyrgyzstan, individual as a person trying to participate in public life, it's becoming a norm in Kyrgyzstan, I suspect. But when it comes, let's say, to gender and ethnicity, that's a problem. Is it a normal, let's say, for Uzbek to come and to say on behalf of him as an Uzbek in public life? Here we don't have that norm. And it wasn't even much the case before June 2010. There were certain problems, but after June 2010 it became even more problematic. So I think there is a certain problem. And I think in terms of the same area, and maybe what Svetlana was saying, there are certain issues with certain wordings. Because the international community uses the word transitional justice. That's something which is internationally understood by this. Legal practitioners, scholars, people in development, and other agencies, they know what it is. But government is not using it. First, pragmatically, because you don't want the consequences. And second, because of norms in the society, which they think they're prevailing, they should be politically dangerous to talk about the transitional justice. And therefore, let's say, the international community presses Kyrgyzstan to do something about transitional justice. Part of the government thinks that we should do something, but we don't know how. And part of it comes to that framing and translating a norm in a bit more convenient way, so it will be politically accepted in society. And by the way, as an anthropologist, I think that when I went to Tashkent, anthropologists could have wrote more there. Because sometimes it's more difficult to rely on what people say, you can much easier to rely on what people do. And for that you need more anthropological instruments.
Any more questions? Then, okay.
One more quick question. To what extent do you think geopolitics plays a role here? That is that regardless of all of these norms and conventions and what the governments say and do, does that have anything to do with the pressure? I mean, the pressure that is put on, let's say, Central Asian countries since 9/11, one could say that it's almost minimal, simply because Afghanistan, I mean, like when John Kerry came to the region, one of the first things he said to all media everywhere, especially the closer he got to Afghanistan, to these countries, the 5 countries, was Afghanistan. The first things that he said to the president. It wasn't the issues of the country, human rights, or anything of that sort. So, to what extent do you think the real politique kicks in, regardless of how beautiful these conventions are or not? What role does it play?
Well, in this issue, geopolitics, yes, it plays a role, especially when it comes to the more sensitive aspects of these norms, politically sensitive. And first it happens, of course, with 9/11, when there was a diminishing pressure on, I think even one of the international agencies, the person who I met was saying that in our document, the words of democracy, human rights, we see less and less of that after 9/11. But I think the next issue comes with the covert revolutions and the increased role of Russia in the region. And you can see, especially, all countries participate in different international organizations and which promote different, I think, position towards sovereignty and certain susceptibility to foreign the external influence. If you are a member of SCO and CIS, there is much stress on sovereignty. Every country decides their internal affairs according to their laws. No one can interfere. And of course, SCE and the others have formulated these other perspectives. And it means that players who are prominent in that kind of institutions, the more prominent in the regions, the more they can define the frameworks through which norms are translated. Which quite often means, let's say, with increase of role of Russia, whatever you're doing with norm making is your own internal affair, which means that external pressure is much limited. So in that way, the geopolitics, I think, is playing the role. But maybe it's just a fresh and new, still emerging story about this general global events, extremism, religiosity, and maybe many things which are coming not only from the West or from Russia, but from Afghanistan, Middle East, that somehow also affect certain normative perspectives. And not necessarily maybe in the centers, and here maybe we may see maybe the two flows of norm making coming from center to periphery, and also maybe emerging flow from periphery to the center as well, especially when it comes to religion. The norm making, which is based on certain religious conceptions, which norms are normal, not normal. I think that is something which is emerging, and that also may be part of the geopolitical story as well. Although it's mostly social, but geopolitical.
Okay, so I can ask one last question. It has a little bit to do with this, with also the question of all this kind of ritual, or as you call it, formula of formative politics. I'm interested, do we have any idea of, I know that in some regions, especially in Indonesia, normal people, social actors as we call them, develop a particular taste for laws, and there is a sort of they consume laws as soon as there is a law published or something. The people will know what the law is about, and they will start, I don't know, formulating claims and defining their rights and their status in society according to these laws. In a way, even if you want, even before, I don't know, governments or courts become aware of this law. In Indonesia, at least, where there is, I don't know, very strong legal anthropology, this is quite a widespread behavior. And I was wondering, do we have an idea in Central Asia to what an extent, I don't know, what do people consume after? Do presidential speeches have some kind of a popularity? Do people listen to them, discuss them, debate them, or, I mean, all this law production on ethnicity, gender and human rights, is it something that, I don't know, do normal people in Kyrgyzstan read these laws, try to understand them, to interpret them, to adapt them to their needs? Do we have, you see a little bit what I mean? I was surprised, just maybe even more. By example, it seems that Atambayev had this speech to the parliament, and he discussed, you know, the transition to a fully parliamentary system. Okay, it's the speech of the president. We can say no one cares about what Atambayev wants to do, but then I was surprised because it seems that quite a lot of people, I don't know, know what the speech was about, and quite a lot of people are now discussing, you know, what is a parliamentary system, what is a mixed system, and so it means that presidential speeches.
Maybe it's somehow in that case it's maybe igniting something which already exists, because the talk about parliamentarism has been going for a few years. Maybe the post-electoral period somehow was quite right to renew it. So it's not maybe necessarily he set the whole tone, but rather it's very general question. Do speeches of political leaders drive the process, or they may be a result of a process which we already ongoing. So in that sense, maybe the case of the satellite which is the second maybe type. And general question about the collection of norms and which mechanisms are legal, political, legal statements, or maybe mass media. It's quite difficult. In the case of Kyrgyzstan, it's just my general observations. Maybe in different areas, maybe different. Let's say some legal norms will change something in the economic life, they can do quickly. Something in the early 90s, privatization, whatever. So general maybe assets or privatization of land, maybe second half of 90s. That somehow maybe much easier for adopted in society. Whereas when it comes to a bit more other areas, it's a bit difficult. With reference to the bride kidnapping, let's say the law exists for many years, and a few years ago it was a much harsh sentence to 10 years, but then it doesn't have an effect. It doesn't have any. So there is a norm of sort of marriage strategies like bride kidnapping. And then how this norm, what affects this norm? And who is it affect? Maybe the president may say thousands of times about how bad is it, but it is like nothing will change. Laws can go up, but nothing will change. And there's the issue in question of what affects it. For me, it's a difficult question. So I would maybe just say it may vary based on the maybe specific issues, which mechanism. So in that sense, the change of the norms and what affects it, it's the similar case like with bride kidnapping, I read that about this Chinese practice of food buying. When girls were buying feet, so they became small, food buying. So one of the explanations, anthropological, political, economic, anthropological, was that it's partially, if you look at the marriage market, so once you change something on the demand side, in demand side it's the conception of beauty. Why is the norm so persistent? Because the conception of beauty on the side of men was static. But something has changed in the conception of beauty, and therefore practically disappeared. Maybe that's, I don't know, the illustration of how the rules are changing. It's a bit further away from political, it's more social. Or I think there was another illustration by hockey players who didn't wear helmets, etc. Everyone understood it was dangerous, and it's better to wear helmets on this equipment, but no one was wearing it. And all of a sudden, at some point, it changed quickly. So why it became normal to wear equipment which protects you? So those things I don't know, but I think the different change of norms and what affects them, it's difficult to deal with it, but in general sense, it's talking about the culture of people within specific countries, but difficult. So Kyrgyzstan, for sure, maybe not very much presidential speeches, and maybe in many cases not laws. That's my simple answer.
Okay, any more questions? No? So, shall we thank Medet once again, especially because he did all for you. I think the audience was extremely lazy today. So, he really deserved welcome.